You make a living by what you get. You make a life by what you give. This quote is attributed to Winston Churchill, although some dispute that. But no matter who said it, it is wonderful food for thought. You make a living by what you get. You make a life by what you give. Now, we all know the difference between getting and giving. But what's the difference between a living and a life? It seems to me that we do a good job of telling the story of our living while we're alive. And it seems to me that other people do a good job of telling the story of our life after we die. What do I mean by this? Well, if we take this quote at face value, it suggests that how we make money or how we get stuff is our living. And we're very good about asking people this part of their story. Think about one of the first questions you ask when you meet someone. What do you do for a living? We ask our children, what do you want to do when you grow up? The implication in these questions is that what someone does for their job is their living, and presumably they make money for it. Now, sometimes we put the word just before our answers with this, right? Oh, I'm just a stay-at-home mom. As if that's not a real job because it doesn't earn a wage. And yet raising kids, keeping the home, these things are invaluable. And we place value on them, or rather we devalue them every time we put the qualifier just before that answer. The same holds true for other jobs, right? I'm just a busboy, just a barista, just a secretary. I just work in retail. I just work at the gym or at the mall, just. And yet you don't tend to hear people say, I'm just a doctor, just a professor, just a lawyer, just a CEO. Somehow those stand on their own. What this suggests to us is that how we as a society understand someone's living is intrinsically tied to what they do to earn money, if they earn money at all. And we care a lot about this while we're alive, which is actually why retirement can be such a hard transition, as many of you know. Because not working to earn money can really strip away a huge part of your identity when that's what you've been doing your whole life. Yet in contrast to how we make money, what we believe in and what we value, and how we live out those beliefs and values is what the quote means by the word life. We make a life by what we give. And we tend to do an excellent job of naming all the ways someone lived a very full life once they've died. We talk about their jobs, yes, but we also celebrate the other parts of their stories, their life as a father, as a son, as a brother, as a husband, as an uncle, as a friend, as a veteran, as a church deacon, as a volunteer, right? All of those identities are not about making money, but about giving something away, whether that's love or time or sacrifice. The thing is, both of our livings and our lives are important to our identities, our stories. What we do for a living certainly informs our story. And how we live our life, how we live out our core values and our beliefs, that is the very heart of our story. Now, Jesus invites us into a life with him, not a living. We're not going to make money following Jesus. I hope I don't disappoint any of you by saying that. We're not going to make money following Jesus. Yet as we live a life of loving others and loving God, we will make meaning and will make a difference in lives beyond our own. You see, to follow Jesus is to give, because giving is inherently a part of paying attention to other people and paying attention to their needs and caring for them. Being community together requires giving. giving something of ourselves away, be it money, time, love, sacrifice. And Jesus doesn't say in Scripture, come make a living by following me. I mean, after all, he invites the disciples to fish for people. They're not going to make money fishing for people. They're only going to make money if they fish for fish. But he says, come follow me. And he says, I have come so that you may have life and have it abundantly. Well, if abundance isn't about money, what's it about? In today's text, we get a snapshot of one moment in the temple. There are details before this snapshot and after it that will inform how we view it, but let's start just with what we see in these 4 verses. Let's let these verses put a frame around this snapshot for us. And as Becky pointed out so beautifully, the first thing we noticed in this frame is that Jesus is noticing, watching, looking at people as they put their money into the treasury. It's not a private matter, right? It's a rather public one, apparently. Now, the assumption is that Jesus might be watching what people put into the treasury because he cares about the amount. But I wonder if that's true. Maybe he's watching the people, not to see what they put in, but to see who they are. In all honesty, it would be very hard to see exactly how much any of these rich people were putting into the treasury, right? They don't have confidential giving envelopes like we do here at Calvary, right? Clanging change is clanging change. And they probably could put their hand in such a way when they dropped the change in that you couldn't tell if you were dropping in pennies or silver dollars. So here we have Jesus, good old-fashioned people watching. How many of you like to people watch? It's fascinating, isn't it? So he's watching people. He sees rich people putting in sums. And Mark only uses this one descriptor, rich. And that word suggests something about what these people do for a living, right? They must make money. But then Jesus notices someone else, a specific someone. Before, the language is a crowd and many rich people, but now Jesus hones in on one person. And the way the story is told, it seems that we are to remember this person by what went into the treasury, 2 coins. Yet before we even get to what this person put in the treasury, we're told who she is. Jesus identifies her. She is a poor widow. Anonymous in name, but not in story. You see, Mark could have just said this was a poor woman who put 2 small copper coins in the treasury, and saying poor woman would be enough of a contrast to all the rich folks putting in large sums. But Mark says poor widow. And in noting this, it allows us to see that Jesus is seeing a larger picture than just the one before him of a woman putting 2 coins into the offering plate. Jesus is seeing the story of this woman's life, or at least a big part of it. Jesus is seeing what happened before this moment and what will happen after. Jesus is seeing that at some point before this moment, this woman has lost somebody she loved. She's grieving. Jesus is seeing the sacrifice that she is making in that moment, putting the 2 coins in the treasury. And Jesus is seeing in his mind's eye what she will go home to, which is hungry mouths to feed, perhaps, her children. The reality is, the woman at the temple was not a poor widow. She was poor because she was a widow. In Jesus' day, by and large, women were totally dependent on males in their lives for their livelihood. And so to be widowed not only meant that you lose someone you love, but you also lost your means of having money. You became totally dependent. Widows were forced to live off the good graces of other people, supposedly off the good graces of the leaders in the temple who took their money in the first place. We'll come back to that in a moment. Now, whereas others would have just heard the click of 2 coins and seen a nobody, Jesus hears the click of 2 coins and sees somebody. Somebody who has lost so much and yet still shows up, still gives. Someone who is still doing her part for the community and for the greater good. Jesus sees something in her giving. He sees her heart, her life, her dependence, her trust. And it seems that that is what is of value to him. It's not about the money. It's about the motive. Yes, the money that we give is important. And yes, Jesus sees way more than the money that we give. How Jesus sees the amount we give is not based on a number or quantity. It's based on what that number tells him about our heart, our faith, our priorities. Jesus sees the story behind our money, which is where the story of our life, of our giving, has meaning. You see, how everyone makes their living may dictate how much money they get. However, how one lives their life, we all know it really has nothing to do with how much money you make. It has to do with the values with which you live your life, how much you live on for yourself, and how much you give away to others. Notice that Jesus says this poor widow has put more in than all those who are contributing to the treasury, for they have contributed out of their abundance, she out of her poverty. She's put in everything she has to live on. The Greek word in here is bios, B-I-O-S. That is, she's literally putting in her whole life, not just what she owns, but all of who she is. And we tend to read this as praise, that Jesus is saying, look, we should all be like this widow. But you can also read this as deep lament. Because Jesus knows the story of this woman, of this widow. He knows that she will not return home to a husband who will provide for her. She'll turn home to, again, hungry children. Nobody in that moment in the temple that we know of, none of the rich people saw what the woman did and pulled her aside and said, thank you so much for your generosity. Can I offer you something? Can I offer you some food? Can I give you a ride home? Can I help you? In other words, the temple that was supposed to be watching out for the widows and the orphans had forgotten its mission, forgotten the story of the God it was to be proclaiming. The elite in the temple had neglected to hear all the stories of its members. And so now we step outside of these 4 verses and we get a bigger picture by looking before and after this text. Because Jesus talks about the scribes in the temple. He says a lot of things about them, but one of the things he says is that they devour widows' houses. That comes 2 verses before today's text. And Mark, unlike Luke, doesn't talk about widows a lot. Mark uses the word widow twice in his gospel. Once in verse 40 and once in verse 42. Clearly, these stories are connected. To Jesus, this woman's story matters. The fact that she's a widow matters. Her grief matters just as much as her giving. In fact, her grief informs her giving. She's learned that you cannot depend on the things or the people of this world to uphold you. You have to depend on God. And for her, a part of depending on God was clearly giving at the temple. In all honesty, those of us reading this passage may be wanting to shout words of warning at her, saying, don't give to the temple, see what's going on there, they're not going to help you out. But what she should or shouldn't do is not our judgment to make. She does what she does, she gives, and Jesus sees her gift as generosity. We don't know a lot about the story of this widow. I wish we knew more. I wish we knew her name, her history, her dreams. I'm grateful what we do know about her through her giving, because everything we do and say reveals something about our story, including our giving. And I think the reason that Jesus says the widow gives more than the scribes or the rich people is because Jesus knows the stories of the scribes too. He knows that they are not caring for the widows and the orphans as they should be. Their actions, their lives, their living are not informing their giving how he would like it to be. And he doesn't say that they shouldn't give. He doesn't disparage their gifts. He just knows that their gifts have intrinsically different worth, primarily because their giving is not transforming their living or their lives, spiritually speaking. It's not costing them a thing. And with Jesus, when it comes to following him with our whole lives, it will always cost us something. That is part of the Christian story, right? Sacrifice. But it's not just sacrifice for the sake of sacrifice. It's sacrifice that leads to new life and new hope, new energy and new dreams. In a moment, as we process down the aisle to give to God our financial commitments for Calvary, we're going to be giving both to God and to this community. And what you have written on your commitment card, none of us is going to see that here today. They're in nice little envelopes. You'll put that in, but we will see you, and God sees you. And when you come forward today to commit financially to this community, know that we are committing to you as well. We're committing to journey with you and care with you. We see you. We see the year that you have had. Maybe it's grief over losing a loved one, months of unemployment, celebration of a new job or an engagement. Maybe it was your hip replacement or your knee replacement or name your joint replacement, or your volunteer hours with Family Promise or Council or with ABW, Missions, The Gathering, or Bootstraps. We see you visiting the hospitalized, the homebound. We see you. We see you when you travel to fun places on cruises or when you serve on mission trips, when you visit family who are dying or celebrate with grandkids who are graduating. We see your daily struggles, raising kids and their crazy hectic schedules, caring for your own parents, trying to make time for yourself. We see your hobbies, your quirks, your joys, your sorrows. We see you because God sees you. And because we are called to have the vision of Christ, the gaze of God's love. Now, we will fail at this, truly seeing you again and again, but we'll keep trying, because that's what community does. We are here to see one another, to journey with each other. And none of us knows our full story. None of us knows what is going into what actually brings us to this sanctuary today, what brought us to Calvary, what brings us to putting an envelope in that box. We can only know our stories when we share them with one another. And that takes a lot of trust, perhaps even more trust than giving financially to the church. But we want to know your story. We want to hear it as 2019 unfolds. We may know what you do for a living, but do we know what gives us life? If you look at the people in the pew next to you, do you know what brings them joy? Why they come here each week? Why does that matter? Because all of our stories make up the collective story of Calvary. And we can only proclaim and live out the parts of our story that we know. The fullness of how God is at work in the world through Calvary is only revealed when the fullness of how God is at work in and through each one of our lives is known. This is why we've been focusing on this spiritual practice of storytelling and listening, because God sees us and we're called to see one another. Calvary, there's a saying from a Catholic brother, David Stindl Rast, who talks about gratitude. He says, truly, every single thing we have has been given to us, and not necessarily because we deserve it. Gratefulness, he says, is the great fullness of our human heart as we respond to the needs around us. And when we give, we plug ourselves in to the aliveness of the world. Let's make a life together, Calvary, in 2019. Let's make a life not just by what we give, but by how we share in life together.